Welcome to Genesis Essentials Session 7. Last week you read about Jacob running away and finding himself in the desert in that place, which he later called Bethel, having a dream where he saw angels and was encouraged by God's presence with him, even in a moment of great fear and loneliness. Jacob received a promise of God's presence, of God's protection, and of God's intent to bring him home at the last. And Colin asked us to think about how those promises might apply to us today. Well, that was not the end of Jacob's journey, geographical or spiritual. The story of Jacob continues. He goes into the land of Padam Aram, away from his angry brother Esau. Jacob has a pretty complicated marriage situation, due in part to his scheming father-in-law, Laban. Basically, Jacob falls in love with Laban's younger daughter, Rachel, but is tricked into marrying her older sister, Leah. Years later, after 11 children, with a combination of Rachel, Leah, and their servants Bilhah and Zilpah, the 12th Benjamin comes along later, Jacob decides it is time to return to his homeland. He has become very wealthy. In verse 10, he says, "I crossed the Jordan with just my staff, and now I have become 2 companies." It's important to notice here a shift in Jacob's understanding, in his thinking, because all along, Jacob has been a snatcher and a schemer, someone who grasped what wasn't his. His name, Jacob, literally means seize by the heel. Remember, as an infant coming out of his mother's womb, he was holding his brother's foot to get ahead of him. Later, he succeeded in cajoling his brother out of his birthright. Eventually, Jacob dressed in skins to fool his father into giving him the special blessing intended for the eldest son. Jacob thought it was up to him to seize life's blessings. But at this moment, as he returns to cross the Jordan to his homeland, he concedes that it has all been given to him by God. Furthermore, it was not deserved. He says, "I am not worthy of the least of all the steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown me." So what has caused this shift in perspective? Is it only gratitude? Is it just seeing all the sheep and goats and children and other good things? No. It is also fear and a realistic sense of his dependence at that moment. Because in going home, Jacob realizes that he will once again cross paths with his brother Esau, who probably still wishes he was dead. It's interesting how experiencing blessing alone does not necessarily lead to praise in our life. Sometimes prosperity can give us a false sense of self-sufficiency, and we forget that all that we have is gift. But God will not permit Jacob or us to remain unaware of our dependence, or conversely, of God's generous and merciful nature. So, just as he's returning home in accord with God's promises, Jacob experiences once again great anxiety for his welfare, for his family, and for the success of God's planned blessing, which flows through his children, who are now in jeopardy. I wonder if you have been brought to your knees by anxiety. It is possible to trust God, but also experience uncertainty. I love what John Calvin has to say about this. He says, Our faith is never so strong at every point that we are able to repel wicked doubts and sinful fears as we would wish. You've got to trust Calvin to simultaneously comfort us that such fears are completely inevitable to the Christian life, but to call them wicked and sinful. You got to love his pastoral, tough love there. He names fears as something that we experience even when we trust God, but he doesn't say that they're good. Well, anyway, that is exactly what Jacob does. He has this fear and he prays to God out of his fear. And after praying, he sends his family and prepares to meet Esau. And then in the middle of the night, he meets a man who wrestles with him and eventually blesses him. It's important to know that it's very clear in the Old Testament, you don't receive blessing from anybody who is beneath you, kind of in stature. So Jacob would receive the blessing from his father, but aside from that, blessing can really only come from God alone. So just the fact that he receives blessing from this random man means that he is not, in fact, a random man. It means that he is mysteriously God. A man who is more than a man we understand to be God disguised. So it's such a mysterious passage. Why did God wrestle with Jacob? Just the other night, our daughter Julia was recounting how one time when she was a little girl, she had arm wrestled with her father, my husband, Richard. She said, "Dad, you let me win." And I actually thought that I had, until later you explained that you had let me win. Of course, Richard had let her win so that she could gain confidence in a struggle that was still a safe situation. And in a similar way, God wrestled with Jacob to test him and ultimately encourage him. What does this mean for you and me? Well, the fact is we too will find ourselves wrestling with God. On the one hand, it seems ridiculous. How can we contend with God? And really, it's only possible if God limits his power and simultaneously gives us the spiritual strength for combat. Once again, quoting Calvin, "For God, having challenged us to this contest, at the same time furnishes us with the means to resist, so that he both fights against us and for us." This gives us a different way as Christians to approach the conflict and trial that we experience in life. We can appreciate that through it, we come to know God's faithfulness and blessing better. So finally, 3 interesting details. First, that Jacob is wounded in this contest. He's wounded in his hip, which is a lifelong reminder that the event with God was real. He didn't make it up. And perhaps that wounds are a part of our journey of faith. They do not preclude God's power from working in us and through us. In fact, St. Paul will later say that it is precisely where he is weak that he experiences the power of God. And finally, Jacob is given a new name, Israel. And he's given great dignity in this name, one who contends with God, from being the grasper to the contender. His name also marks him as the figure who stands for the whole of Israel, he being the father of the 12 tribes. I know that you'll have a rich discussion on this passage. There's so many details to consider. How have you experienced wrestling with God? What has come from that experience? In Jacob, we see such a human, flawed being, chosen, loved, redeemed, tested. And in his story, we see the story of Israel herself, but also perhaps our own story of faith.